Hi everyone, my name is Aileé and I'm a music producer from Canada. Over the last few weeks, I participated on a challenge where many different music producers had to flip the same sample and make a track based on that. On this video, I'm gonna go over how I sculpted all the different playable instruments in the song from the original sample. Let's dive in. So this is the original sample that we all had to work with. So firstly, I chopped and organized the different parts of the sample into 3 categories: percussive, tonal, and textural, plus a time-stretched version of the sample. Then I tuned all the chops that produced a distinguishable pitch into a note that would fit into the key of A minor. I created all these different instruments by placing different chops of the sample on a sampler device and playing with the volume envelope and the EQ. Leads A, B, C, D, as well as this harp-like synth all come from this part of the sample. I used EQ to accentuate different frequencies on each instrument, and I processed them all differently to get varied timbres. Leads A, B, C, and D all have an instance of overdrive, 2 instances of Lock Deluxe, and a compressor for makeup gain since the instrument was a little quiet. For lead A, I made a sound with a fast attack, medium decay, no sustain, and a pretty fast release. I automated the overdrive settings over time to get a slightly different tone as the track progresses, and I applied a bit of sidechain compressor to let the kick through. The most important part of this particular sound is this instance of echo, which is set to a 16th note delay with very little feedback so that the repeats don't drown out the original signal. Here is the sound without echo. And here is the sound with echo. For lead B, I have a fast attack, but this time I set a little more sustain and a longer release than on the previous sound. Then I automated the decay to change over time to make the sound a little bit more dynamic and interesting. The EQ settings on this sound are a little more gentle. I wanted to keep more of the harmonics. Once again, the overdrive settings are automated to change over time. On the first appearance of this sound on the song, I added an instance of Filter Freak. I started with the preset Double Downer and adjusted the settings to taste. And then, on the second appearance of this sound, one instance of Lock and Filter Freak are automated to turn off, as the EQ is automated to only let through a very narrow band of low-mid frequencies, and the overdrive is automated to the darkest tone setting and to be 100% wet. For lead C, I did a slightly longer attack and a longer sustain and release than on lead B. I boosted 1 kHz for more bite in the tone and scooped around 750 Hz to let the other synth occupy that space. On the first appearance of this sound, I automated the decay to become longer and the tone of the overdrive to become brighter. On the second appearance, the tone is quite dark. Overdrive is set to 100% wet, and I automated an instance of Phase Mistress to turn on at this point to detune the sound slightly. On the third appearance of this sound, which is in the build-up, I automated a low-pass filter to slowly open up and the sustain to go down over time as to build excitement with a more percussive sound. Then, towards the final 4 bars, I gave it just a little boost with the EQ to cut through the mix a little better. D, I created a sound with a short attack, just a little bit of sustain, and a medium release. The decay on the volume envelope is automated to change over time, starting with a longer decay on the first few bars, then followed by a short decay to match lead A, which I layered for a couple of bars to add depth. Finally, the decay automation does a V-shape on the last few bars, first becoming shorter and then getting longer. Playing the melody higher, paired up with Filter Freak, created a very characteristic techno lead sound for this passage. As the drop progresses, the melody line plays lower and lower. The second instance of Devil Lock only turns on once the melody plays on the lower register to give it a little bit of a boost. For the Harp Synth, I made a sound with a fast attack, a long decay, some sustain, and a long release. The EQ settings are pretty gentle because I wanted to keep most of the harmonics. I only scooped here to open up space for the vocal sample in the background. I set the tone of overdrive to dark, and I added a chorus and an instance of echo. Echo is set to a 16th note delay with 42% feedback on the ping pong delay setting. This voicing is doubled with the bell sound below and playing spaced out arpeggios to add some texture to the build-up. This next sound combines two different instruments, which again are made using a sampler. The Pluck comes from this part of the sample, and it's here to give the combined sound more attack. I automated overdrive to get more distorted over time and give the sound a little more crunch. The auto filter is also automated to slowly open up during the first appearance of this sound and ease the transition from a different lead sound. I have an instance of Lil Radiator to make this sound a little more gritty and an EQ after that just to keep it restrained. And once again, a scoop right here to let the vocal come through. The second part of this instrument comes from this part of the sample. I applied a notch filter to get rid of that nasty peaking frequency and a low pass filter to soften the overall sound. The resulting sound reminded me a little bit of those vintage organs, so I added an instance of tremolator to lean more into that vibe, as well as an instance of decapitator to get some nice warm saturation. This video is not sponsored by Sound Toys, by the way. Finally, an instance of echo, set to a 16th note delay on stereo mode, 30% feedback and 38% wet. Both of these instruments were grouped and I applied a little bit of glue compression to the sum. The bass comes from this part of the sample. I made a sound with no sustain and a very short release because I wanted to create a driving bass line. This was the most challenging instrument to work with because when played on the lower register, it sounded more like a texture than a distinct pitch. So I was stuck with a relatively high bass. I had to compromise by making the kick lower than I usually would, so they didn't fight for the same space in the frequency range. I grouped it with a sub-bass from one of Ableton's native instruments, and I added that group to the drum bus. Most of the information on the original sample was focused on the mid-range, making the mix a little muddy. So I put a high-pass filter at around 300 Hz on all the lead sounds and a low-pass filter on the bass somewhere after 400 Hz to clean up the mix as much as possible. I had to give the bass a little boost as high as I could afford to because otherwise it lost presence in the mix. I hope you enjoyed that first part of the breakdown. On my next video I'm gonna go over how I made the beat as well as the ambience, transitions and ear candy from the sample. You can also listen to the full track right here. If you'd like to subscribe, I would appreciate that very much. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.